So chapter 33 is called Anglican Renaissance. What were the Anglicans? They were the Church of England here in the United States after the Revolution. They're called the Episcopal Church, in part because they want to divorce themselves from being seen as tied, to the King of England and all the other things that went along with that. And for a long time, being English was not considered to be a particularly good thing, after the Revolution. But then times changed. And you notice that here in America, English always has a certain prestige. If you speak with an English accent, that kind of raises your class status. And the Anglican Church was actually affected by that, or the Episcopal Church was affected by that here in the United States. Like your book tells you, in the Northeast, particularly New York and Boston and Chicago, these areas were developing very quickly. A lot of money coming in, a lot of new wealth being generated, and a lot of the wealthy people found themselves leaving their other churches and becoming Episcopalians. Now, why would people trade up, so to speak, with churches? What sense would that make, do you think? Have any of you ever seen somebody doing that? They shop around for churches until they find one that matches their perceived status or the status they'd like to have. There's a lot of famous people that actually are Episcopalians that you never would guess were that, and some of them converted later on. So why would people do that? Yeah?
Because people want to find a church that they feel best suits them or best suits their beliefs, and they want to feel comfortable where they're practicing their religion.
That's very good. So if your wealth is increasing, if your income is increasing, generally people want to be around people like them, right? So the Anglicans or the Episcopalians were some of the wealthiest, the most well-connected members of the Protestant Establishment. Their main rivals were the Presbyterians, particularly in the South. So like your book points out, a lot of people were being attracted to this denomination that represented the allure of English customs and traditions. Your book talks about prep schools, this entire network of prep schools that developed based on English models. So it's not just about English, the Church of England. It's about English culture, about, sort of raising your status. For example, a lot of celebrities get made fun of because they start out American and then they start speaking with an English accent. Can you think of anybody recently who that? The last person I remember getting flack for that was Madonna, but there have been people more recently than that. Why do they do that? Well, because there's sort of an inferiority complex that goes on, and being English seems to be a bit more cultured. So that was the case at that time. Your book also talks about the revival of male and female Anglican orders. Remember, Henry VIII had closed the monasteries, sent all the monks home. This was something pretty revolutionary, to start new monastic orders or restart them. And then your book talks about the institutional church. We've already talked about that in terms of the social gospel. The institutional church is the church that is providing a lot of social services. And many of us just take this for granted as being part of what a church would do, having a soup kitchen, for example. But that was a fairly new thing, and the Anglicans got involved with that as well. So it talks about the connection here to the social gospel and liberal Protestantism. And before this time, you'd mainly talk in terms of, is an Episcopal church low church or high church? What this meant was, did they have a more evangelical type of style? Low church was more like other American churches? Or were they more like Roman Catholics in having a big emphasis on liturgy? Anglican churches that are high church are often called smells and bells because, incense, which has a nice smell to its frankincense or things like that. And then bells, ringing at the appropriate times. So this was a big issue here. And then they added to that something that you would call, broad church. And the broad church had to do with social engagement. Had to do with changing society. So it talks about this guy, Philip Brooks, and the broad church movement. And the idea was to try to transcend this split and say, everybody can fit in. Everybody can belong. Now, in practice, it didn't always turn out like that, but that's where they were going. So a lot of the things that affected other Protestant denominations, the questions about biblical criticism, evolution, really didn't affect Anglicans that much compared to the other Protestant denominations. In part because if you have a broad church, you can say, well, we all just sort of agree to disagree, but we're all part of the same big umbrella. Now, your book talks about the Anglican Renaissance. When you hear that term Renaissance, what do you think of?
Rebirth.
What's that?
Rebirth.
Very good. That's literal meaning. Naissance is birth. Rebirth of what, though? What would it mean? In this context, yeah.
It was like an explosion of culture in the arts, and people thought in a new way for the first time, express themselves.
Yeah, you're talking about the Italian and Northern European Renaissance, right? Not the Anglican Renaissance. Because there wasn't an explosion of totally new stuff. But yeah, you're right. At that time, they recovered a lot of ancient Greek stuff, and they took that as a model, and they generated a lot of new other stuff. So rebirth of the arts. And you can talk about Renaissance in terms of other things. You can talk about an economic Renaissance. You can talk about an educational Renaissance. Here we're talking about things that are specific to the Anglicans. And so if they are a liturgically oriented, a church-oriented denomination, one of the things that's going to be very important for them has to do with worship, the structure of worship. Now, your book talks an awful lot about architecture. Why do you think architecture is important? Think about it like this room, for example. Are there any ways that this room could be reworked so it would be a better educational experience for you? Yeah.
You could play with the walls and the ceiling to make the sound better.
Yeah, that's very true. What else? That's a very utilitarian thing. What do you guys like? You're in a lot of classrooms. Which classrooms do you like here? Yeah.
Technology is always cool for us at the firm, so
Yeah.
anything that has a bunch of computers or big screens.
Could be kind of cool, like if we didn't have to pull this thing down and totally block all of the boards, if we could use both at the same time. Okay, that's a good idea. Anything about like the physical appearance of things here?
Windows.
Yeah, windows would be nice. There are some back there, but you can't see anything through them, and they're just little narrow slits. Why are windows important?
Just let natural light in.
Yeah, rather than this fluorescent light. What else about windows? What do you feel? What does it feel like? Yeah.
They let you daydream.
Okay, yeah, that's very true. I did a lot of that as a student. Maybe some of you would kind of like to do that. And that's, now think about carrying out worship, where it's the same thing, the same sort of pattern week after week after week after week. What are you doing when you're daydreaming? What part of you is engaged?
Your imagination.
Very good. And religious service is in part about engaging the imagination. So is education, by the way. When education works well, you come away from something and you've thought of some new things. And it doesn't necessarily have to be whatever the lecturer is talking about. If you're in a really nice location, you might think of things that get sparked by some tangential point in the lecture that turn out to be very important for you. And when it comes to worship, the same thing goes for why they designed the cathedrals. How many of you ever been in a cathedral, either here in the States or you traveled abroad? What did you notice about these things? Yeah, go ahead.
They had different colored windows that you could see lots of different light through, and it was just really pretty.
Okay, so actual beauty is something that's emphasized. What is the stained glass supposed to do besides look pretty? Yeah.
But they usually tell like a story, like the glass.
Yeah. You know, they used to call the cathedrals Bibles in stone. Because you could like look around. Imagine if you were illiterate. I'm not saying Anglicans were illiterate. They were actually some of the most literate people in this time that we're talking about. But the ancient cathedrals, you could look around and you could see all these stories depicted. So if you wanted to teach your kids about, you know, Samson and Delilah, look over there. You've got an image that you can actually tie that with. So the Anglicans are doing stuff like that, and they're reincorporating that. That was something that was seen as, you know, going against the low church thing. If some of you have looked at those images of Puritan meeting houses, you notice there's nothing there. It's just white walls and woodwork, and the woodwork is not ornate. There's no, you know, special moldings or anything like that. It's purely utilitarian. The idea with this was that the cathedrals, the churches themselves could represent what was supposed to be happening in the service. So your book gives a few examples of the Gothic revival. And there's a few churches that are worth pointing out. And that's really most of what they talk about in this chapter. So let's look at a few of these. They talk about Trinity Church, which is, where is that one? There we go. Boston's Trinity Church. Trinity served to display not only this guy Brooks' preaching, but other arts that were undergoing a revival at the time. So sculpture. You would place sculptures around. Commission people who are famous. Murals. Clergy of other denominations were also being drawn into this. Where the Anglicans would go, they would tend to bring a lot of the other churches with them, at least the ones that were attracted to that sort of thing. Your book also talks about the National Cathedral. How many of you, before you read this, knew that we actually have a cathedral for the United States of America? Nobody? It got used for, the 9/11 memorial service. Whenever we have some major event, they use this cathedral. It's actually an Episcopalian cathedral. So you might say, well, how can they do that? Well, there's sort of an understanding that it's going to be used for interfaith, interdenominational services. But in its day job, it's a cathedral that's used by the Episcopal Church USA. And it was deliberately designed that way. So this had a major impact, not only on Anglicans, but outside of that, on Presbyterians, on Lutherans. All these other denominations got drawn in. The more high church they were, the less low church, the less evangelical they were, the more they started to say, well, we need to have beautiful churches as well. We need to spend some time on the architecture. We need to commission famous artists for this sort of thing. Your book also talks about some literary figures, some of whom you've probably heard of, some perhaps not. How many of you read, when you were kids, Madeleine L'Engle, like Swiftly Tilting Planet, or Wrinkle in Time? What else did she write? You remember? You read the series. She was an Episcopalian author, and those books have a kind of, Christian slant to them, without actually talking about Christ very much, or without talking about God very much. There's kind of a theology built into them. You guys all know about C.S. Lewis. What's he famous for?
Narnia.
Yeah, Narnia is the land talked about in 7 books. Yeah.
The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe,
That's
or the Chronicles of Narnia.
Yeah, and so he makes up this entire universe. Part of the story takes place in this world, part of it takes place in Narnia. And what's he doing in there? He's actually telling a lot of stories that are pretty overtly Christian in their structure. Like, those of you who are into this sort of thing, what does Aslan represent? You've already answered enough for right now.
I know.
God. The Aslan represents God, and how do you know that? Because he's a lion? That's not really. What's the key thing that he does in that first book? Yeah.
Well, doesn't he, the stone breaks and then he,
resurrection.
It's like Easter, right?
Yeah.
First he's sacrificed for, who was the rotten kid? Edmund, because Edmund was a traitor, and then he takes his place. Who's that like?
Judas.
Well, Judas is the traitor.
Yeah.
Who's taking the place? Like Jesus, right. So there's a lot of Christian imagery built into that. That's part of this Anglican Renaissance. Lewis actually was a university professor. He wrote a lot of really interesting books besides the Narnia stuff. But this is an important chapter. It's a very short one, but it's sort of telling you how things got steered in a certain direction.